I want to thank our sponsors for being part of this. And whenever we ask our summit attendees for speaker suggestions, the number one person who comes up every year is Dan Walters. He's always at the top of the list. Dan Walters is the premier political pundit for California and has been for a number of years. He's been a journalist for over 60 years, following Capitol politics and policy, and is an expert on many things. But most importantly, he has an opinion on everything, and that's what we're here to learn about today. Dan has worked for a number of Sacramento newspapers, but right now, Dan is doing his work through CalMatters.org. So I encourage you to read him on a regular basis. And without further introduction, here's the speaker for today, the California premier political pundit, Dan Walters. Thank you so much for Dan for joining us.
Hi, this is Dan Walters at CalMatters.org. And I want to invite you and welcome you to virtual Sacramento, where the legislature is in virtual session and doing maybe virtual things. We really don't know. Whenever the legislature is in session, however, I'm reminded of something that a man by the name of Gideon J. Tucker said back in the 19th century. And that is, when the legislature is in session, no man's life or property is safe. So that's a good aphorism to take when you're considering Sacramento. But on a more serious note, I really wanted to talk today about kind of an overview of what's going on in California, economically, demographically, culturally, and of course, politically at the very end of the parade. You know, sometimes we tend to think of politicians as leaders, as they're leading the band in some way. They're out there front with the baton leading the band. But in fact, in many respects, politics is a trailing occupation. And what goes on in the real world actually creates then political issues for politicians to deal with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the real world of California and how it's been evolving over the last several decades. When you look back at let's say, go back about 4 decades, as Jerry Brown was finishing up his first stint as governor in 1982, and then carry forth to the present time where Jerry Brown just finished up his second stint as governor a couple of years ago. That's a 4-decade period, and the amount of change California has seen during that period is absolutely breathtaking. And we should have been reminded about that just last week when the State Department of Finance told us that for the first time in California's history, California lost population last year. Think about that. This is a state that was kind of founded on the whole idea of go, 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 growth, 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 more people, more people, more people, people coming to California, people having babies. And that was true, very true, until, roughly about 25 years ago or so. Back in the 1980s, think about this. The 1980 census pegged California's population at 24 million. And just 10 years later, in the 1990 census, the population was 30 million, a 6 million person growth in 10 years, a tremendous rate of growth, 2% a year. That's a huge rate of population growth, as any demographer could tell you. But then starting in the 1990s, things started slowing down. Why? What happened? What's going on? Well, for one thing, we had a big baby boom back in the 80s, and the baby boom kind of ended. All those young immigrants who came to California did what young people do, and they had babies. And then in the 90s, the birth rate started to decline, and it declined more in the aughts, and it declined more in the tens. And now we're in the 20s, and it's still going down. Fewer and fewer babies. We were once generating over 500,000 babies a year in California. That's a baby a minute if you do the arithmetic. And it's gone down and down and down and down. At the same time, however, because we're not producing so many babies and because we're not getting so many young immigrants, the population of California is aging. The median age is going up and up. And as the age goes up, the death rate goes up. So fewer babies on one end, more deaths on the other end. That slows population growth. At the same time, immigration from other countries slowed to a trickle. And in state to state migration, we started losing population a couple of decades ago. More people leaving California every year than are coming here. And you put all of those factors together, it adds up to zero or negative population growth. Now, a lot of the news coverage of that event got a little carried away and talked about, well, it was because of the pandemic and all the people who died of the pandemic, or it's this or that or the other. No, actually, if you subtract the people who died in the pandemic, we would have still lost population in California last year. In fact, we probably have been losing population in California for a couple of years, but it just now showed up in the statistics. And this is an important thing because it's one of those life-altering events for or societal-altering event, I should say. It changes everything. It means fewer kids in school in the long run. It means fewer workers coming out of school in the long run. It means more older people who require services in the long run. Over time, it reduces the demand for housing. It reduces the demand, or at least plateaus the demand for consumer goods and services. All of these things are affected by the fact simply that no longer is California a fast-growing state. Even if we move into the positive population growth slightly, take it to the bank. California is not going to be growing like it has in the past. There's no chance it's going to happen. So we're going to hit, we're not even quite 40 million yet. And we may never get, in fact, to 40 million. And think about it, not too long ago, demographers were saying we'd be 50 million by 2030. Well, that's just not going to happen. We'll be lucky if we get back to 40 million by 2030. And it's illustrative of the things that occur, because they did not happen in isolation. Other things have been happening in California over that last same period. One thing that happened is the nature of the economy changed dramatically since the 1980s. We were still somewhat of an industrial economy in those days. It had already started to slow down, but one by one, industrial plants shut down in California. The tire factories, the automobile factories, eventually the aerospace industry got clobbered by that syndrome in the early 90s, which led to a out-migration of more than 1 million people out of Southern California during the 1990s. And that's when we really started to see population decline in California. So we have seen this dramatic change in our demographics. We have seen a dramatic change in the economics. We are no longer really an industrial state. We are now a post-industrial state. We're, from an economic standpoint and from a taxation standpoint, we are very, very dependent on the high-tech economy of the Bay Area, inordinately so. And essentially, it's propping up the entire state in an economic sense, and certainly when it comes to generating revenues for state government and local governments, that's equally true. So we've seen the economy change, we've seen the population grow slow, and we've also have been seeing over this same time period a very, very dramatic change in the makeup of California, the human makeup of California. We were once kind of white bread state. In the 1970s, when I started writing about politics in California, about 85 or 90% of Californians were white Anglo. Today, the white population is well below 40%, actually, or 50%, down actually at around 38 or 40%. In fact, Latinos have become the largest single ethnic group in California. But that's just the most simplistic way of looking at that kind of change. We actually are a state that is made up of dozens of ethnic and racial groups, cultural groups. We are easily the most complicated society on the North American continent. The school system, see this, many school systems have kids speaking 75 or 80 languages. The court system maintains interpreters for something like 150 languages. This is not your grandfather's California. Everything about this state has changed, and changed rather dramatically in a relatively short period of time over the last 40 years. And finally, we are seeing political change on a vast scale as well. At one time, California was one of the most reliably Republican states in the nation. Even up until, you think about this, in the post-war era, the post-World War II era, until 1992, California had only voted for a Democratic presidential candidate twice, just twice, in that post-war period till well into the 90s when Bill Clinton won in 1992. And ever since, Democrats have won every single presidential election in California. But just a decade earlier, in the 1980s, look at the makeup of the political makeup of California. In the period between 1980 and 1990, there were 10 top of the ticket elections in California. Top of the ticket meaning governor, senator, or president. There were 10 top of the ticket elections in California, and Republicans won 8 of the 10. And this carried into the 90s, into at least the mid 90s. In 1994, not only did Pete Wilson win re-election to a second term, rather handily over Jerry Brown's sister, Kathleen Brown, but Republicans took half of the statewide offices that year and even had a nominal majority of the assembly. Think about that. There were 41 Republican seats in the state assembly in the mid 1990s, and now it's down to what, 20, maybe 22, 23, something like that. That's an enormous change over that period. What happened? Why did California undergo such a dramatic political change during that period? Well, demography is part of it. The outflow of population after the collapse of the aerospace industry changed the politics of Southern California generally, but particularly the politics of Los Angeles County. And up until that point, Los Angeles County, as big as it is, about a quarter of the state's population, Los Angeles County was essentially neutral. A Democrat or a Republican might win by a few votes one way or the other, but Republicans held many of the county's congressional seats and legislative seats. And the LA was essentially neutral, which meant that the interior of California, plus San Diego and Orange counties, which if you look on a map, it's like a fish hook, and people called it the fish hook, down the center of California and hooking into San Diego and Orange counties, were very reliably Republican in those days, offsetting the very reliable Democratic tilt of the San Francisco Bay Area. And in that mix, actually, Republicans could do very well. They could win statewide offices easily and frequently. Think about it. It was basically a Republican state, a purple state maybe, but a Republican state. Ronald Reagan, of course, was elected president, won California's presidential elections twice in 1980 and 1984. And George Bush won the presidential vote of California in 1988. But after that, that was all done. So what happened? Well, when the aerospace industry of in Southern California kind of collapsed with the end of the Cold War, and contracts were canceled, military bases were shut down, the county saw a huge outflow of population. In Southern California, an estimated 1.25 million people left Southern California for other places, and most of those from Los Angeles County. But in the meantime, the county had seen an inflow of immigrants from Latin America and from Asia, and a resurgent labor union movement among immigrant groups in the service industries that replaced the aerospace industry. As a result, LA's politics started moving leftward to the point where it basically is as blue as any place in California, as blue as the Bay Area. Republicans hold very few local seats in the legislature and Congress, and basically Southern LA, and then now shifting into Orange and San Diego counties have become much less Republican than they once were. And you put all that together, you see a Republican Party that's declined to under 25% of the registered voters, and a handful of legislative seats, a handful of congressional seats, a tremendous fall from political power that they enjoyed just within the last 30 years. It's been a tremendous change. Now, all of these changes, including the political change, affect the output, what goes on in the political realm of California. Very dramatically affects it. this was the seat at one time, as we can all recall, the seat of the much vaunted tax rebellion in 1978, the passage of Proposition 13, which heralded that period there of the 1980s and into the 1990s of Republican strength in politics in California. And so at one time, we had this very more or less dependably conservative political atmosphere in California. But what happened, obviously, is that as the Republican registration fell, as newcomers to California, Latinos, Asians, became active in voting, became more democratic. And frankly, what happened is Republicans alienated a lot of white voters, the white suburbs of California that had once voted Republican, even in the Bay Area. Back in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, you saw Republicans from the whole legislative and congressional seats from San Francisco Peninsula, from the East Bay Area, Contra Costa County, all elected Republicans. They went away. Republicans lost traction in the more affluent white suburbs that had been a bedrock area for Republicans, including Orange County was certainly an example of that, and most of San Diego County was an example of that. But as that occurred, not only did the Democrats achieve more power within the Capitol overall, but finally, super majorities, and then most recently, super duper majorities. Basically, 3/4 of the legislature now is Democratic. And it has moved the political atmosphere in the Capitol several notches to the left. How far to the left, we don't know, because there's been some constraint upon that in recent history. Jerry Brown particularly, Jerry Brown 2.0 was kind of a dampening or conservative or moderating influence in the Capitol as long as he was as governor, following Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was kind of the same way, and even following Gray Davis, who, except for his affinity with the public employee unions, was something of a moderate himself. Now we have not only a super duper Democratic majorities in both houses of the legislature, but they are dominated overall by the more left wing of the Democratic Party, or progressive wing of the Democratic Party. The wing that, for example, denied Dianne Feinstein the party's endorsement when she ran for re-election in 2016, and gave it instead to one legislator, and the legislator who was challenger. That illustrates that the Democratic Party has not only become larger and more powerful within the political realm, but it has moved markedly to the left. And you see that in what's been going on in the legislature over the last couple of years. Once Jerry Brown left, the progressive wing of the party saw an opening, saw an opportunity to do things that they have been wanting to do for a long time, but had been constrained from doing so mostly by governors who were relatively moderate. But they saw in Gavin Newsom a simpatico figure, somebody who sympathized, who verbally at least endorsed the agendas that the progressive wing of the party wanted to implement, such things as universal preschool education, single payer health care. That's the kind of agenda that the left wing of the party. Now, what are they up to? What do they really want now that they're in the ascendancy in the Capitol? I think, and they really don't make many bones about this, what they really want is to make California something like the Western Europe welfare states, Sweden and Germany and France and Norway, something like that, with much more lavish public benefits of all kinds, paid for, of course, with much higher taxes. And Gavin Newsom has essentially, verbally at least, endorsed virtually all of that agenda. and added a few things to himself. But he was constrained somewhat as well in his first year as governor by just being the first year as governor, and had some financial constraints. Obviously, the pandemic constrained him further last year. I mean, he put it off. He put off a lot of stuff simply because, well, it's pandemic. You got to deal with that. Whether he deals with it effectively or not is something the voters may pass judgment on later in the year. But now, in this year, in 2021, the pandemic appears to be in remission, hopefully, thankfully. And by the quirk of, I guess you'd call it pandemic economics, the efforts by the federal government to keep the economy booming with low interest rates has then generated huge gains in the stock market, which have then translated into a cornucopia of revenues for the state government. How much? The governor said the other day that we have a 75 billion, that's billion with a B, budget surplus. Now, he hasn't told us the details of that, how they came to that conclusion, but he assumes it's true and is basically proposing to spend all of that $75 billion, plus another $25 or $26 billion in federal relief funds for what he calls a $100 billion package of services and reforms that would advance to some degree the agenda of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Start off on Mother's Day with a announcement that they're going to expand childcare, another one of the tenets of the left agenda. He backed that up later this week with a whole new array of just simply giving money to people on the theory that it will stimulate the economy. He wants to hand out about $20 billion in direct payments, $600 per taxpayer up to a certain income limit, and also money to pay all the past due rent bills for the people who fell behind on their rent, and to pay all the past due utility bills. He's added more to the pile, including a $15 billion program to combat, he said, and eliminate homelessness. And we still have more to go because he'll finally unveil the whole package on Friday. And it's like a Democratic, it's like a if we call it the Bernie Sanders advocates, the Sandinistas, it's like or Bernie-crats, it's the Bernie-crat dream agenda, basically. It lacks only universal health care, and we haven't heard about that yet, but we'll probably hear something about that in the budget as well, expanding health care coverage, Medi-Cal coverage, possibly more to undocumented immigrants, for example. So this is, I think you might say, is Gavin Newsom's big chance. He always likes to do the big thing, what he call the big, hairy, audacious goals. And this is his chance finally, with money in the till, or at least he says the money's there, to do some of these big things. And he also has obviously financial and political support coming from the Biden White House. So we don't know how much of it's going to go through the legislature, probably most of it, because the legislature is dominated by people who endorse that agenda and the leadership seems to be behind it. It'll be an experiment, but there's also a danger to it. The danger is this. A lot of this money that he wants to spend is essentially one-time money. It's money that comes from this windfall of taxes on capital gains and incomes among the affluent. Remember, the top 1% of income taxpayers in California, about 150,000 tax filers, pay almost half of all the income taxes. And those folks have done very well in stock markets and other investments over the last year. And California is reaping the bounty of that. But it's one-time money, or at least it's not money that you can say will be there year after year after year. And the danger of it, it strikes me, is that he is raising expectations. He's raising expectations that we will have universal childcare, free or no little low-cost childcare, that we will achieve his goal of universal health care coverage, if not single payer health care coverage. That's a more complicated issue. And other items on the progressive agenda. He's raised things that this is the way it is. It's going to be, he describes it as a change, a massive change. It's something that's going to be a whole new world of California. Maybe he's overselling it, I don't know. But that's the way he describes it. But he's raising those expectations that we're going to start approaching the Western European model of social democracy. But where's the money going to come from to sustain it? And the danger, it seems to me, is, or the peril, or the uncertain factor in all this, is that once you start offering entitlements of any kind, and you might say, well, we can shut them off if we don't have the money. That's an extremely difficult thing to do, virtually impossible. So what happens if you build up the expectation and people start getting these benefits, they start expecting these benefits are going to be there. And then when you don't have the money to pay for the benefits, then the drumbeat of taxes, higher taxes, is felt. And as we probably all know, California is not a low taxing state. California has really quite a high tax level. We're in the top 3 or 4 or 5 states when it comes to the combined state and local taxes, about 12% of personal income. And that's about as high as it gets in the United States. We're up there with New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, and we're in the top tier states already. So the question then is, can it go higher? Well, there's an appetite in the legislature certainly to make it go higher. I think the California Taxpayers Association said that something like $200 billion a year in higher taxes are contained in the bills that have already been introduced this year. Now, I don't think they're going to pass anything this year. In fact, the governor has said, no, we're not going to do more high taxes this year. After all, he does face a recall election and doesn't want to do anything that might upset the apple cart. But the question is not what's going to happen in 2021 or maybe even in 2022. The question is what happens when the inevitable next downturn comes in the economy, when tax revenue plateaus out or even declines, and we have all these new entitlements that people have become accustomed to. It's the kind of the catch-22 of what he's proposing, and it'll be the other shoe that drops at some point down the line. Now, he may not even be governor by that time. He may be a United States senator by that time. That's entirely possible. But at some point, when you offer all these enhanced entitlements to people and people get accustomed to them as being their right, then you have a problem when the bill comes due. And this is what we don't really know what's going to happen in the long run and this thing. We're in this period of change. We have had the demographic change. We've had the economic change. We've had the partisan change. Now we're going to see the fruits of all that, or the outfall of all that in what the governor proposed to do, something that is transitional, it changes everything. And it'll be a vast experiment in one state, whether California can go down the Western European model, high taxes, high services, and frankly, as a model perhaps for the rest of the country, if the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has its way at the national level. So once again, we're in the spotlight. We were in the spotlight 43 years ago when California launched the tax rebellion with Proposition 13, and later the GAN spending limit, which by the way may be triggered by this cornucopia of legislation this year. The money that the governor wants to give back to people, tax money, basically satisfies the GAN limit, or may satisfy the GAN limits mandate that when revenues grow to a certain point, you have to give some of it back. And he says he's giving some of it back. So this is the state that launched the tax revolt, with Howard Jarvis and Paul Gann, and eventually with Jerry Brown, who signed the bill to put the Gann limit on the ballot in 1979. And here we are 43 years later, once again in the national spotlight, not as the seat of a tax rebellion, but perhaps as a model for transforming into a Western European style social democracy. So once again, here we are back on the cutting edge. Whether it's a good cutting edge or we'll all get sliced up by it, it's hard to say. And with that, on that happy note, I should say, I'm going to turn the program back to Allan Zaremberg, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today.